Okay, so today the thing that I wanted to talk about was free will. Now that might sound like a super obtuse topic to start off with, but hear me out, okay? So traditionally there have been two schools of thought when it comes to free will, right? The first one is absolute free will, which means you can do whatever the fuck you want, right? I could go out right now and eat those leaves off the bush outside and nobody could stop me. Like that would just be a thing that I could do and would do given the chance, or maybe to even show that I have free will, I would do that, or maybe I'd like go eat oatmeal or something even though I don't like oatmeal. But the point is, you can do whatever you want. That's radical free will, right? And on the other side, you have radical determinism. Now, what is determinism? Determinism is the idea that everything is laid out. Everything is planned. There's no free will. Everything just happens the way that it happens, and you don't really have much say in the matter, right? So you're just stuck doing the things that have already been planned out. But this is the thing. When you're living a life as a human being, you feel that you have free will, right? It's a thing that you kind of just understand that you have. Like when you're a kid, you tell the kid not to touch the stove and they understand that that's something that they can choose not to do. Free will means you can choose to do things, but it also means you can choose not to do things. So a lot of the argument against free will is like, you have free will, but you're not using it. So do you really have free will? And I'm like, do these people never play any video games whatsoever? Like, if your concept with this is like the most reductive analogy maybe possible to reduce free will to the concept of online video games, but here we go. I'm gonna try. I think it works. So hear me out. If you've ever played an online game like League of Legends or Dota or Smite or even like Overwatch, right? There's this concept of the meta game, which is like the optimal strategy to do something, and the optimal strategy is like the best strategy. It's like the best default strategy that you can have. So, for example, say you buy like a particular item in League. I never played League, so I don't know. So you buy this particular item, and that's what you do. And then someone might ask you, hey, do you really have free will if you buy this particular item every single game? And you'll be like, yeah, I could buy some shit tier item, but I don't. Because I know that this is better. So when you look around you and you see everybody just going from home to work and then back again, it's really not because of a lack of free will, right? Everyone has free will, I think. It's just a matter of how they choose to exercise it. Now, at the same time, if you think about it like that, you can also say, is that really a meaningful free will if you're choosing not to exercise it? And I would say to that even if you choose not to exercise it, you still have free will. Like, have you ever walked along a bridge and then you look down at the river and you see somebody in a boat and be like, hey, I could jump off this bridge and land on that boat and that would be badass as fuck, right? Obviously, that's self-evident that would be badass as fuck. But you don't do that. Why don't you do that? Is it because you lack the ability to do that? Or is it because you've considered the consequences in your head and decided not to do it, right? Because free will is not only for positive action, it's also for the lack of action or negative action. You can act or you can choose not to act, but both those choices have equal value. Yeah, but I'm not really a radical free will kind of guy, just because if you look at the fundamental nature of the universe, right, like the most granular size that you can look at, which would be like the size of quarks or like subatomic particles, that's like as granular as you can get with the universe. When you look at that level, not everything is predetermined. Like, not everything is entirely knowable. Let me explain. The physics people are going in the comments right now and being like, hey, you're wrong, you suck, you don't know shit. Hear me out, okay? Quantum mechanics, like for example, take an electron, right? That's like the most simple system ever. An electron, even in that system, where it used to be thought that like it has this mass all the time and it's in this place around the atom in a little loop-de-loop. That's where it is, just around the atom. And that was like assumed to be a thing. But now we know that's not really a thing. And an electron is like a disturbance. It's like it has its own little field that it has, and then we don't know exactly where it is or how much momentum it has, and we can't know both at the same time, and you can know one perfectly, but then you have no idea what the other is. So to me, it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty there, which makes perfect sense, because to have a universe that was so simplistic as to allow just radical free will or just radical determinism would be way too simplistic of a system. Think about it. And this goes back to the nature of the binary in general, right? The self and the other, right? Like the whole Hegel's dialectic thing. There are two opposite poles, and then these two opposite poles always exist, right? Like one of the examples, in like just to relate it to modern day politics that I thought of, or not that I thought of, I think it's been thought of a lot. It's been discussed a lot recently. Is whenever there's a new incident of gun violence, one side always says mental health, and the other side always says guns are the problem, guns are the problem. So you think about it and you go, hey, you know, like these people that are doing this shit, they can't all be there in the head. They can't be all there, right? They have to have something missing. Otherwise, they wouldn't do this shit, because everyone has those feelings of like anger and rage and resentment, but not everybody acts on them, right? So there has to be some difference between me and them. That's like the intuitive understanding that you arrive at. At the same time, you look at guns and you go, you know, if that person had a knife, how many people could they have killed? Right? And you could say like, oh, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And right, you're right, people do kill people, but people kill more people when they have guns. Really, that's not the point here. The point I was trying to make is, you split an issue into two opposite poles that can never meet, and then you claim that they can never meet, and then that they're mutually exclusive. But mutual exclusivity, I think, is one of like the most overrated concepts in human knowledge. It's like, you have mental health and you have gun control. Why can't you have some semblance of both? Like, don't sell guns to people with mental health problems, but you can still sell guns to everybody else. That seems like a common sense solution that we would have arrived at if we weren't so dogmatic about being in one or the other camp and not accepting. Let's go to something else. So the other thing that I want to talk about, I don't want this to descend into like gun violence talk, because that isn't productive. So let's talk about another binary that we're facing in society right now, which is capitalism and communism, right? And both have their supporters, and both of the supporters are very fervent and determined that their solution is the right solution and there's no other solution other than their solution. And it got me thinking. First, let me talk about capitalism a little bit, right? So capitalism, to me, seems like an emergent concept from the concept of evolution, right? So Charles Darwin invented evolution, or discovered it, or whatever, described it, I guess would be the best way to put it, in the early 1800s. And then, suddenly, or maybe not so suddenly, you had Adam Smith, John Locke, I guess, those people, not sure on the names, but one of those is right at least, who described the system of capitalism, a free market where people compete for goods, services to get people's money and stuff like that. And hey, coincidence that they're both very similar, like both describe systems where organisms or corporations compete to gain dominance and prove that they're better at doing something than the other corporation, and they're rewarded with money, or the analog in the Darwinian system would be food and the ability to reproduce, which corporations don't need to reproduce because they're an ever-living entity, right? So to me, it seems like if you were to simulate a Darwinian system on a computer or something like that, the analog would be very similar to what we have in the capitalist system already, which is that you have, like, if you had little bits of code that compete to get some kind of a resource, like how they have the AI networks, right? The AI, what are they called? Like enemy networks or adversarial networks, that's what it's called. Well, they have those networks that compete or criticize each other in order to create a better product. And kind of our capitalist economy is kind of like that. You have all these companies operating to get people's money, right? That's what it is. People's money is the resource, the only resource that matters in the capitalist system. So they have They're competing to get this money, and as they become more successful, instead, like in an organic system, what would happen is they would pass on the code that they learned to the next generation of corporations. But because corporations don't die, they can continue. And instead of changing from generation to generation, they incorporate the lessons that they learned into their superstructure. So they change while existing in the same generation. Like, think of a website like YouTube, right? When YouTube first launched, it was not anything like it is today, but it's still the same entity, right? Just like humans today are still humans, even though we're not very similar to the humans that were originally around when Homo sapiens became a thing. But instead of iterating through individuals, right, they iterate through sexual selection, natural selection. This is iterating through the process of being rewarded by money in the marketplace or the larger global economy. But the problem is this, right? Because corporations can never die unless they commit some kind of like huge mistake. They either die immediately, like most companies that get formed, I think most businesses that get formed fail within the first 3 years, or they go on to succeed for much longer, right? So there's like, I guess the analogy would be like sea turtles giving birth to all those like thousands of little sea turtles that some make it to sea and some don't. And those that make it to sea last longer than the ones that don't, right? There's like a huge mortality, right? And then a lower one, just because of the way that their levels, it's a whole thing. That's not the point. The point is, because a corporation lasts for so long, it can incorporate the lessons that it's learned from its mistakes. Like nowadays, the mistakes that a corporation makes would be like saying something insensitive on Twitter, and then they would incorporate that by like making it part of their branding to be more progressive or something like that, and they would iterate that through the corporation. Hopefully that becomes like part of their corporate culture. So then that's like the genome, if you think about it in a way, like the recipe for success, right? All the lessons that they learned over the course of the company being alive is inculcated and like codified in their company structure and in the way they do business. That's like the way they interact with the entities around them. The point I'm really trying to make is this. Because of the way the system is set up, corporations can never die, right? And in a real free market system, which is not what we have a regulated system, which I'm fine with. I'm not a free market essentialist. That's not what I am. I'm just saying, in a non-completely free market where there are regulations, corporations are incentivized to find ways to break those regulations. I think other people have already said this before, so I'm just going to paraphrase very quickly, is that a completely amoral corporation doesn't mean just that it's evil, it also means that it has more options than the other companies around it. Okay, that being said, I don't want to elaborate too much on that just because I think that's a given. So given that, what happens then with corporations? Because profits are limited if they compete with each other. A corporation's only goal is to maximize profit. So to maximize profit, you have to minimize loss, right? And a lot of loss comes through competing with other companies. When you're a certain type of business and your goal is to increase profit to the maximum, sometimes the best thing to do is not to outcompete the other companies around you, because it's not a completely free market and you won't be rewarded for doing that because there are regulations and there are limits to what you can do. The best thing to do is to just fuse, right? It's to become an amalgam of every single company. And we've seen this a lot. We've seen this with every single large media company. We've seen this with every single large telecom company. Why? Because the amount of profit they can make is limited to how much the customer is willing to spend, and there are only this many customers with the ability to pay for these products. This is a very macro scale explanation. Let me explain it like this. There are only 7 billion people on Earth, right? How can Disney maximize their profit in that system? Disney has a reach that encompasses the entire world, right? So at that point, you're not worried about outcompeting people. You're worried about making sure that every single human on Earth can buy your products, but that's not the case. There are multiple continents where people cannot get Disney products, right? Like all of Central Asia, there's no Disney. And I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about like the Middle Asia countries like Kyrgyzstan and like Turkmenistan and stuff like that. Then you have like the extreme poverty in humongously populated areas like India, which severely limits Disney's reach. Then you have almost the entire continent of Africa. The internet is severely limited. I'm pretty sure Disney has some reach there. I'm not saying Disney has no reach, but they don't have the market penetration that they do in North America, right? In Canada and North America, Disney is everything. If you are a child, you have spent multiple hundreds of dollars, or you have had spent multiple hundreds of dollars in your name to Disney. So this is just an example. I'm not saying Disney is some super evil corporation. I'm just making out an example of what they can do. So the only other way for them to make more money is because they have already reached every single human that they can reach. The only other way for them to make money is to join with every other media property on the face of the earth. They've already bought Marvel. They've already bought Star Wars. And when they buy big ticket items like this, it's not to reach more people. It's to give a wider variety to people who already buy their shit. They're not trying to make you buy one thing. They're trying to make people who buy 2 things buy 3 things by giving them an option of 55 things to choose from. When you have a large variety like that, you feel like, oh, hey, I like that character too. Let me get that as well, right? So eventually what's going to be left at the end, because we have no real strong regulation on monopolies, is that it's just going to be one super corporation. And I'm not so convinced that it will be limited to one super corporation being limited to one industry. I'm not so convinced about that. Before my camera overheats, let me end this. So when there's only one superorganism left, right? Now, the evolutionary system doesn't work like this because the environment is constantly changing, right? So the organism that's best adapted to yesterday's climate won't be the organism that's best adapted to today's climate. But if you look at the economic situation of the past 40 to 50 years, not really that much has changed, right? Wages are stagnant. There's a new emerging middle class in the Far East that will be in Asia, primarily China. There's a very large new middle class that has a lot of new money. But Western countries don't really have that much access to that huge population of people. So really the only way for them to maximize their profits, right, is to become one large entity. Now think of it this way. Think of it like this. I don't know how many of you saw the new animated Godzilla movie on Netflix, but it's kind of like that if you think about it. When the environment is static, then it makes sense to have just one extremely large predator that can evolve itself. Because Godzilla is evolutionary, it's not static, it doesn't stay the same. So even if there were to be an emergent new threat, that superorganism could adapt itself to fight that threat, right? I don't think it's the best analog to the evolutionary system, but I do think it works that way in the capitalist system we have now, which is not entirely free market, but somewhere in the middle between free market and completely communist. Now I'll get into that divide in a little bit, but I really want to explain this superorganism example a little bit more. So the defining trait, I would say, of this superorganism slash supercorporation that we will end up with at the end is that not only does it, in order to have perfect control, in order to be the perfect superorganism that never dies and never needs to reproduce, it can't not have control over its environment. Now what that means is when it doesn't have control over its own environment, that means it is subject to change. Change is a threat to the superorganism because it thrives in the current climate. If there is to be some kind of change, that means it has to change to accommodate. But it doesn't want to change. It's already reached perfection, right? It's already reached the maximum possible profits. So what does it do? It has to change the environment around it. And by that, what I mean is it has to change the systems such that they maximize its profit. Now this might sound a little bit anti-corporation, but hear me out here. I don't think this is what we're going to end up with because I think we'll divert from this path long before that, but hear me out. The point is when you reach this superorganism status, this corporation has complete integration into everything, right? Because every single corporation more or less is rolled into one humongous, and it might be like one parent company with like multiple offshoot. Effectively, it's the same thing. Even if it has multiple controlling structures, those structures don't compete with each other because they're in different verticals, right? That's a business term. I'm sure the business people got that. So yeah, so it has complete integration into every single aspect of ordinary life. So what that means is it has perfect reach. So what does it need to do? In a democracy, what does it need to do? It needs to make sure that the laws that are being passed don't affect it in a bad way, right? And this could be done in multiple ways, right? And right now we kind of see that a little bit where the corporations influence the politicians and sometimes even just give them bills that they present in Congress without even changing the first line of it, which says, put your name in here. They don't put their name in. The point is, that process isn't as holy as we would like it to be. Now, a lot of the reaction to this realization or this thought experiment is to go the complete opposite way. It's to ditch this entire way of life and to go completely the opposite way and arrive at what I think is the only competitive form of communism we've ever seen, which is the Chinese model, right? The Chinese model where the state is deeply integrated into all the national companies. And because their population is so large and they have such a tempting market, they use that as leverage to get IP from other companies by integrating them with their own companies. They had this model in the early 90s in India as well, where foreign companies that wanted to invest in the Indian market had to partner with the local company in order to do that. Like, there's some examples. You can probably Google that and find out. The point is, that's the only real competitive model of communism we've ever seen, which is capitalist competition overseen by the state. Now, there's a small problem with this, which is that in other capitalist economies, the companies that are competing with these state-partnered companies don't have the help of the state to help to increase their competitive edge, right? So the Chinese government has such a tight grip on everything that occurs within its borders that it maximizes the use of all its resources in a way that capitalism just doesn't, because there's infighting, right? So in China, a lot of the state-run stuff is used to further the interest of the Chinese country and people as a whole. And that's really why we've seen them rise so much, is because the government is using the capitalist system while still being communist in order to further their development, right? That's why we've seen their GDP per capita grow so much. We've seen this whole new emergent class of middle income people. Now, that system has its own huge problems, right? It's a surveillance state to the complete maximum. They have face tracking cameras on every traffic post everywhere. And they have heavy censorship on the internet, not fake censorship like we have here, heavy, real government-sponsored censorship. They cyber attack other countries through state-run hacking groups. They're not the best example to follow here. So you have on one end the ideal free market system, which no one has yet realized effectively. We're kind of close to that, but not really, because we have the welfare system and all that. And then on the other side, you have so really, both of the extremes are not represented, right? The free market capitalism, completely free market capitalism, doesn't exist. We've determined that isn't an ideal model for us, and since welfare was introduced in 1960s or whatever, don't quote me on that, that's a whole thing. Yeah, and then on the other side, you had pure communism, and that didn't work either. Both extremes didn't work. So we have we've reached 75% on both sides. If you think of the bell curve, there's extreme 0%, extreme 100%. They're at 75% on both sides. Right. So you have capitalism with a little bit of welfare. That's what we have. Let's call it capitalism with a little bit of welfare. That's fine. And on the other side, you have communist capitalism. I think that's more catchy than this one. I don't want to call this welfare capitalism, because we're going towards that in the next portion of this video. Right. So you have 75 percentile on both sides, but there's still a large gap between them, which is something that people haven't been able to gulf recently. Okay, before we overheat. So what ends up happening is that you get stuck with these two percentiles, right? 75th, 75th. And we used to have, the US was way more free market than it is right now. And some people will say that it's more welfare, but I think we spend more as a percentage of GDP. By we, I mean you, because I'm Canadian, I don't give a fuck. They spend more on percentage of GDP now than they have ever done before. That's percentage of GDP, so that's not a population statistic. That's more of a, you spend more now than ever. Whether that's cost effective or not is not my problem, but they do spend more now than ever before. And on this side, you have a communist system that's utilizing the capitalist free market and playing it in such a way that they gain the advantage. Now, from current years, you could look at this system and say, hey, China's been doing really good lately. Shouldn't we like move this 25th percentile over to the 75, like somewhere like 60? Wouldn't that be the right place to stand right there? And I would say to you, there seems to have been equal progress from both sides towards the middle. Now, that could be conflicted, but I'm just clarifying it like that to make my point, which is that we started off with two extremes, right? We started off with a 0 and a 1, a binary. And then now we're progressing slowly over time. It isn't a Hegelian immediate synthesis type thing, although he did say that we progress towards the synthesis. We're progressing over time towards this middle ground. And that seems to have happened purely from the way that people spend their money and through like deciding who's doing better off. Like the system realizes that something is wrong with itself and fixes itself because that's the way that we iterate now. That's how systems iterate now. We don't completely destroy the system and start over again. That was an attractive strategy in the past, but I don't think it's possible now. And let me explain why. In the past, there were far fewer people, like way, way fewer people. And if you look even for a second, and you might not like utilitarianism at all, but if you consider that even for a second, right, just the sheer numbers that are involved now, like look at Venezuela. Venezuela tried to pivot, tried to do an about turn from capitalism to radical communism, and it is going horribly for them, right? I think the people are eating rats, they're eating dogs and shit like that. No, that's not cool. Like, that doesn't work on any level. We don't want that at all. So if nothing else, and you might say that, oh, they're doing it wrong or whatever, but the point we have to learn from that is radical change is not acceptable anymore. The system is too big to turn around in such a radical way. There are 7-something billion people on the planet right now. So we can't just swing this convertible into like a little drift and then do a U-turn and come down. We can't do that anymore. We need incremental change. But the problem is incremental change, incremental meaningful change may be the most difficult thing to do ever. Right? Radical change is possible because it happens in such a short period of time that the people who start the change are there to oversee the end of it, and that they can inspire the people to finish the change the same way that they inspired them to start it in the first place. And we've seen this even recently, as close as 2011, with the Arab Spring movement, where a bunch of governments were overthrown, and we haven't seen that really pick up and have them flourish in a way that I would deem for that to be a success. But it was successful in a period that it mobilized a large number of people in such a short span of time that really hasn't happened for like 60, 70 years since the fall of colonialism back there. So radical change still is possible, but I don't think we need it right now. I don't think radical change is something that we desire even. Because as we've seen from this drifting towards the center, right? The system is changing slowly. And that might be the worst thing to say to someone who wants to pick up guns and rise against the government. But I will say that to you if you're thinking of doing so. And you probably hate me, and that's totally fine. Stay hydrated. You might hate me. That's totally fine. I would say to you, the government is too big for any one people to take it down as a whole, because it's so easy, and I talked to someone else about this a couple days ago, it's so easy to brand an offshoot of a movement as extremists, because we've done that already with the other side. And I don't see any reason why we wouldn't do that to our own side. By we, I'm talking about the West in general. Why we wouldn't do that to our own side with people that have a particularly egregious way of going about things. Because really, the only way that we do things now is by revealing, is through revelation, right? Now, that might sound very religious, but let me hit you with this. Snowden, right? Snowden did a lot, I think, to just put the question of privacy into people's heads. And there were people thinking about it before, right? The community that he rolled in, I'm sure, thought about privacy way before he did those leaks. But now, privacy is like a thing. In 2018, there have been more laws passed to protect privacy than in any year before. Maybe this is just a recovery from all the loosening of the privacy morals that came after 9/11. We don't know. And there are still insidious forces trying to cover this. But with GDPR and with all the laws that Congress has been trying to get passed this year after they saw GDPR, I think we're in a new paradigm where we've realized what the tech corporations can do and we've kind of let them have free reign over the past couple of years, even the last decade or so. But now we're starting to rein them in, just like in the 1860s, how corporations were allowed to just burn coal, and there were oil fires that burned for decades for no real purpose. And how those were reined in later when they realized what damage they were doing to the environment. Now the tech corporations are being reined in after seeing what damage they can do to our privacy and with the information that we gave them, which they misused, right? Which most people would say that they misused, but is given right there in the terms and conditions, which is, they has to be, otherwise they could be sued, right? The point is this, just how we're going to reach a dialectic. We're going to reach a synthesis, a Hegelian synthesis, for lack of a better term. I think that's the best term to describe it. It could just be called compromise, but compromise is not something that we really want to talk about in this day and age. So what is this new system going to look like? What is the 50th percentile agreed upon mark going to look like when we do reach it? I don't trust this camera at all, so before it overheats. What was I talking about? Yeah. So the system that we arrive at the 50th percentile, what is it going to look like? Now, the term that I've come to call this, because I think it's been described before, and the guy who suggested it is such a fucking badass at naming things. I'm just going to go with what Eric Weinstein called it, which is anthropic capitalism. Now, I've watched pretty much every video I can find of his. I don't know if he's written a paper about this, but if he has, I haven't found it. And it's called anthropic capitalism, I suppose, because he's adding another variable for the system to optimize for, which would be humans, right? Currently, capitalism is a system that selects only for profit. It's optimized only for one thing. When you optimize all the way for only one thing, you sacrifice literally everything else. Everything else has to be sacrificed to achieve maximum profit. Now, you might say, hey, look, there are these nice corporations out here like donating to charity, like recycling and like cleaning rivers and stuff like that. They do that to get goodwill, right? Corporations are not interested in anything else but profit. That's not their fault. They were created as such. They can't do anything else. So what does this anthropic capitalism mean? To me, it means, I don't know what it means to Mr. Weinstein, but to me it means that it's capitalism that is directed towards the fundamental interest of humans primarily. Now, what does that mean? Now, there's a concept that has been rolling around for a while recently, which is universal basic income. Now, universal basic income is, at its core, it just means the government gives money to people to exist. So they don't have to worry about getting money to existing, and that anything they do above the bare minimum, which is existing, that is just a bonus. So everyone will stay alive from birth to death, regardless of what they do, right? Now, this seems at first to be a very attractive concept, right? It's like, oh, hey, that just seems it seems really archaic that if you don't do certain things, you could die. Or if you try certain things and you fail, that you could fail so bad that you die. And that there are social safety nets to catch you as you fall, but really there isn't anything that guarantees that you will live an acceptable quality of life from birth till death, right? There are homeless shelters. There are welfare programs to some extent, but food stamps don't really work all the way. I think homeless people use food stamps more than anybody. I might be wrong. Don't quote me on that. That's just a assertion that I'm putting out there. Anyway, here we go. The point is this. In the current system, you're not guaranteed any quality of life, really, unless you do the things that you're prescribed to do. Now go back to point one, right? What is the meta? The meta is you go to school, graduate high school, get a college degree, maybe get a master's degree if you're highly educated and you want to. They say people who get a master's degree get like a plus $15,000 a year in salary. So maybe you want that. You spend a year and a half or 2 years and get a master's degree. Maybe you get a PhD, right? So you have all this education. You've invested all this time in order to do what? In order to get a job and to make sure that you exist until you die, that you don't just randomly die one day of starvation because you don't have enough money or whatever. Because no one's giving you money. You have to go out and work to get your money. Now, this just completely goes against a fundamental principle of American thought, which is you have to work for your living, right? Now, one of the character building things that middle class and maybe lower class and sometimes even upper class parents make their kids do is get a job when they're very young. so that they understand the grind that they have to go through to get money, that they value money more and learn the value of hard work, right? Hard work is something that we value at our core. But if you think about it, what is hard work really? It's dedication to a task in order to get a reward, right? But the other agents surrounding it really aren't valued that much. No one says you have to work for a blue chip company. Like you have to work for GE, you have to work for GM, and we don't value who you work for. It's the work itself that we value, right? So it seems to me that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of work itself. And that is what makes universal basic income so repugnant to certain portions of the populace, right? They see that people are getting money for no work, and the initial reaction is, fuck that, I'm not giving money for people with no work. This is coming out of my fucking tax bill. I'm working to pay for people staying at home doing nothing. But let's take it back. Let's take it back to slavery and why we hate slavery so much. We hate slavery so much because it's going against people's will. It's forcing people to work and they get no reward out of it. So we already know that work for no reward is bad. We've already decided that as a society. Forced work for no reward is bad. But let's look at another portion of that, shall we? Forced work. What is forced work? If you kidnap somebody from their native country, bring them across an ocean in a boat, put them on your plantation and tell them to work or that they'll die, that's forced also in a way. That's forced. That's the most primal way to force somebody to work. What about if you look at an indentured laborer, right? I make you work on my farm, or I let you work on my farm. I don't know how I convinced you to do it. I let you work on my farm and I tell you, hey, you know what? Money, there's not really any stores around here, so where are you going to spend your money? Why don't I give you coupons to buy stuff from my store, right? You'll still survive. You'll still get food. You'll still get education because I have schools here on my factory that your children can go to, right? The quality of life is almost the same, but we don't allow that anymore. Why don't we allow that? The reason we don't allow that is because it's an anti-competitive system. That guy is paying him in coupons which are without value anywhere else. Now, if you think of money as those kind of coupons which have limited value, right? They have a value that we decide upon, but at any second, if the country collapses, they could have no value. If the price of things radically goes up, that money could have no value. So really, we're only arguing about what reward is sufficient to justify the work without questioning why we work in the first place. If the only reason you work is to put food on the table, and you working is not doing anything but enriching another body, and you are not getting anything out of it except basic sustenance, is that work that valuable in the first place? That's what I would ask to those who are detractors of universal basic income. Because the people who will not work from receiving this income are the very bottom earners of society anyway, right? The current problem with the welfare system is that people who are on welfare don't want to find a job because they will be off welfare should they find a job, and their total income will decrease. And with this, that's not a problem. So you can work or not work, and any work you do will be additive, and it won't decrease your bottom line at the end of the day. So what we arrive at is that universal basic income is good for the bottom level of society, but there are those people who say, why do you still give it to the top level of society? Well, it's much easier to ask for a system where everybody is equal. Otherwise, we arrive at the same problem that we have now, which is that welfare is distributed only to the poor, and the rich people who pay taxes but don't receive any benefit from it see it as a burden on them. Now, if we just distribute it to everybody equally, we're still distributing it to roughly the same amount of people because there are so many more poor people than there are rich people. And I think that cost is worth it for having the system go through in the first place. Okay, that is that. But universal basic income, I don't think is achievable anytime soon, right? Now, what does soon mean? Soon, I would say like within the next 40 years. That's a conservative estimate. And that depends on how fast our technology progresses. So let me do it like this. I looked up the amount that the US spent on welfare, and I think it was like $700 or $900 billion, something like that. Maybe less. Probably less than that. I don't remember exactly how much they spent. So their annual GDP is like $19 trillion. This is all Google numbers, so this could be different, I don't know, as of 2017. And the welfare number was 5% of what their entire GDP is, which is a very large number, right? But if you look at what universal basic income would cost, universal basic income would be like 4 times that. It would be 20% of the whole GDP. So you're spending 20% of your entire GDP to make sure your population survive. Is there something wrong with that? Probably. If you're spending 20% of all your money, or all the money that your entire country is involved with an entire year, to make sure that your population just makes it from point A to point B, then what are you going to do about the rest of it? Because that's the basic level. That's like the bare minimum that you can do for your populace, is to make sure that they survive from point A to point B. If that's all you're doing, what are you doing for the rest of it? What are you doing about infrastructure? What are you doing about technology? What are you doing about education? What are you doing about healthcare? What are you doing about defense, right? That's an important thing. What are you doing about all the other things that a government is required to do? Parks and services. What are you doing about any of that stuff? Department of Transportation. What are you doing about any of that stuff? You are severely decreasing the amount you have left to spend on the rest of that. Now, people will say, oh, hey, that's not a big deal at all. The US spends $600 billion a year on defense. To that, I would say, that's not going to change anytime soon. I'm sorry. Look back at what I said before about how the super corporations have have the control of the environment, you know? That's not going to change anytime soon. So what can we do about this? Well, to me, it seems like 5% of the GDP is like the max that you could ask a government to spend on welfare, which is universal basic income is by definition welfare. It's not the welfare that we're used to now, it's just welfare. For the better welfare of humanity as a whole. So what can we do? Well, there's an easy way to do it, and here we go. The main argument that people make for a necessity for universal basic income is the advent of AI, right? They said AI is going to displace all the jobs, and it's going to make everything faster than humans can possibly do it. So we're going to need a universal basic income to make up for the large population, or the large percentage of the population that's going to be completely unemployed with nothing to do. We have to make sure that they exist, otherwise we'll have a huge problem on our hands, right? And unrest in the population. That's bad. That's always been bad for the people in power historically, right? Remember the Russian Revolution? 90% of people were slaves. How did that work out? Not well for the Tsar. Okay. So, moving forward, what can we expect from the AI revolution then? If you say that AI is going to drastically change the way that economies work today, and it's going to make all human work outdated, then I expect AIs to like completely change the size of the global economy. If we're not limited anymore by how much human labor is being used to produce certain products or consume certain goods, if business to business interaction, and the only thing that's really limited is business to customer interaction, like retail sales won't go up that much, but everything else along the line will become radically cheaper, radically easier, radically faster. Right? That's just a thing that will happen. Like, we don't know how far 3D printing houses will go, but like redesigning complete everything from the bottom up through AI, like, can you expect a 4x increase in the size of the economy if you incorporate AI, right? Now, if you look at that, what stands out to me immediately is the US economy, after that kind of AI revolution, which you would need to justify universal basic income, would be at $80 trillion. Is that something we can expect to have? Can we expect the US to have an $80 trillion economy in 40 to 50 years? Probably not. Let me justify that. But I don't think that's a death knell for universal basic income. So here we go. A large proportion of the population of the Earth in general is not getting a $60,000 a year per capita income. That's not happening. Not even fucking close. Not even in second world countries like fucking China. In parts of China, that doesn't even happen, right? And it's not going to happen anytime soon. We're at super late stage capitalism in the US because it's been going on for so long here that we've reached that late stage, the first world status. Now, what we can do is, can we 4x the value of the global economy? Now, that to me seems like a more doable goal. And you might say, what is the difference? The difference is, if you want to 4x, which means 4 times, the size of the entire global economy, you don't need to 4x the US economy. That doesn't need to be a thing. There can be substantial growth in the US economy, but small countries, marginalized countries that have had severely underrepresented or underfed, fed with capital in a way, underfed populations, when they reach that emerging nation status, they will grow their economy much faster than the US will be able to at this late capitalism stage, right? So will they make up for the fact that the US won't be able to grow as much? And will we reach that global 4x? This is just a random number that I came up with. It's just an example of what the economy will look like after the AI revolution, right? Will we reach that global 4x threshold point where universal basic income will be sustainable? I don't want to say yes, but I don't want to say no. I can see a future where that happens, right? And when we reach that stage, maybe that's when anthropic capitalism will become a reality, or will become a system that we can all sustain, if not accept. So that's everything. Okay, bye.
Get used to it, get used to it. Get used to it, get used to it. It gets worse, the closer you get, it gets worse. The closer you are, worse. The closer you get, it gets worse. The closer you are, the more you reach out, the more he'll hit you and strike you down. Have an exit plan.